Larry, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm still on mute. Good evening, everyone. I'm Lara Marita. I'm Senior Director for Planning and for Community Planning and Engagement. We are excited to be with you here tonight. I do want to do a couple housekeeping things before we get started. Go to the next slide, please. I'm going to start with interpretation. If you need interpretation, please click on the interpretation icon for Spanish, Mandarin, or Cantonese to hear a simultaneous interpretation of the session. Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese speaking participants may also contact us for additional assistance via email at dcpcityofyes_dl@planning.nyc.gov. Could the Spanish interpreter please read the slide?
Oh,
Oh,
the interpreters are already in the channels and the interpretation is currently underway.
okay. Thank you, Tom. Next slide. So like I said, it's so great to see you joining us tonight. Hopefully you've been part of several information sessions over the past year about City of Yes for housing opportunity. If this is your first time joining, welcome. We're really happy to be here with you tonight. We look forward to your questions and comments if you haven't been here before. So tonight begins a new series of information sessions where we will take a deeper dive into each of the components of housing opportunity. Tonight, we will talk about the universal affordable preference. In February, we will talk about accessory dwelling units, building conversions, and small apartments. In March, we'll focus in on missing middle housing, which is about low-rise buildings. Then in April, we'll come back together again to talk about the proposal as a whole. So for tonight's agenda, it's very similar to other ones that we have done in the past. We will start with a presentation and then dedicate the rest of the meeting to answer your questions related to tonight's theme. During the presentation, you can submit written questions by using the Zoom Q&A feature. And once we start the live Q&A, you will have an additional option to ask questions by raising your hand in Zoom or pressing *9 on your phone. We will call on people in the order of when the hand is raised. And we'll take in we'll go back and forth between questions, live questions and questions in the chat. So everybody has an opportunity to ask their question in the best space that they feel most comfortable in. Sorry, I thought I heard something. Next slide. If you are joining by YouTube or do get disconnected for some reason, as a reminder, the instructions for joining these meetings are through nyc.gov/yes-housing-opportunity or through the nyc.engage.nyc NYC.gov/engage portal. The NYC Engage portal is where you can find all DCP meetings as well as other meetings that are happening across the city. If you wish to participate in the meeting by phone, please call the toll-free number at 877-853-5247 or 888-788-0099. For toll numbers, 212-338-8477 or 253-215-8782. When prompted, enter the meeting ID, which is 864-6760-2082. And then you hit the participant ID, which is pound. And the password is 495-865. And if you have any questions after this session, please feel free to email us at thehousingopportunity@planning.nyc.gov. You also can sign up for our newsletter, which will have all of these sessions will be made available to you, and you can get more information as it becomes available. We'll drop that into the chat so you can find it on our website. Next slide. So to get started tonight on our first theme info session, I'm going to pass it over to Winnie Shen, who is a housing planner here at the Department of City Planning, and she's going to run through a presentation. Then we'll again follow with questions and answers after the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lara. Hi, everyone. I'm Winnie Shen. I'm a planner here in our housing division at City Planning, and really excited to have this opportunity to talk to everyone about City of Yes for housing opportunity. It is a citywide text amendment that would change zoning to allow for equitable housing development. The text amendment will enable the creation of a little more housing in every neighborhood by removing the layers of exclusionary zoning that have created barriers to housing growth and updating our zoning to better meet the needs of New Yorkers today. If each neighborhood from the highest density to the lowest density areas adds a little more housing, New York City can add a lot more housing overall without any single neighborhood experiencing dramatic changes or overtaxed infrastructure. A little more housing in every neighborhood will have other big picture benefits for New York, including strengthening the local economy and supporting our environmental goals. And this complements the other two City of Yes text amendments, City of Yes for economic opportunity and City of Yes for carbon neutrality. Next slide. The City of Yes initiative would unlock housing opportunities in every neighborhood and give New Yorkers more housing choices. Each aspect of the proposal will help lower housing costs and help our neighborhoods thrive. We'll be going over the major components of the proposal tonight and in upcoming info sessions. Tonight's presentation will focus on the Universal Affordability Preference, or UAP. And this will allow for bigger buildings for affordable and supportive housing in every medium and high density zoning district. We also propose eliminating residential parking mandates citywide, removing the conflict between housing and parking. We're also enabling more missing middle housing or low-rise apartment buildings in our low-density areas. And we do this through town center zoning in commercial corridors and transit-oriented development in highly accessible areas. We're also aiming to help homeowners in our low-density neighborhoods by creating an accessory dwelling unit program or an ADU program and providing small buildings with additional flexibility in our zoning to adapt over time. Next slide. So before I dive into the specifics of UAP, I just want to provide a brief overview of how zoning works in New York City. Zoning regulates how land can be used and what size, shape, and height buildings can be. The main zoning tool used to regulate building size or bulk is called floor area ratio, or FAR. And this regulates the amount of square footage that you're allowed to build. Each zoning district in New York City is associated with an FAR. For the purposes of housing opportunity, we generally divide our zoning districts into two categories, low density and high density. Low density refers to our R1 to R5 districts that allow for single family, two family, and low density multifamily buildings. And these areas are shown on this map here in blue. High density refers to R6 to R10 districts that allow for larger apartment buildings at a range of densities. And these areas are shown on the map here in orange and yellow are where a UAP will apply. Next slide. Tonight we'll focus on the universal affordability preference, which is one of our biggest proposals in medium and high density parts of New York City. Under our current zoning, each zoning district gets the same FAR, or the amount of square footage you're allowed to build, regardless of whether you're building market rate or affordable housing. But there is an exception. If you're building affordable senior housing, you get more FAR, meaning you're allowed to build a bigger building. We just want to take that existing preference for affordable senior housing and extend it to all types of affordable and supportive housing. This means that the FAR for market rate housing won't change, but you'll be allowed to build about 20% more so long as that extra room is occupied by affordable housing. Next slide. UAP can have big benefits for New York City as a whole. By allowing for buildings to be about 20% bigger, so long as anything in that extra room is occupied by permanently affordable or supportive housing, we can encourage incremental affordable housing growth throughout the medium and high density parts of the city. We recognize that our current restrictive zoning has put intense pressure on some neighborhoods to produce housing, while other parts of the city have added little to no housing, and in some cases have actually lost housing. Every neighborhood in New York City needs to do its part to address our urgent housing needs. Next slide. So this map shows which zoning districts have an existing senior housing preference today, shown here in a light orange color. Through the UAP framework, all forms of affordable and supportive housing will be able to take advantage of the higher FARs already afforded to affordable senior housing in these districts. However, there are a few districts that don't have the senior housing preference today, shown in dark orange on the map. So we'll be creating new FARs for those districts to enable the growth of affordable and supportive housing in every neighborhood. We also want to make sure you're actually allowed to build a building that fits that square footage you're allowed, so provide height increases in places where you need an extra story or so to actually fit that affordable housing. Next slide. So this is a mock-up of how UAP will play out. Without UAP, the building is built according to the base FAR for market rate housing. The result is this 8-story apartment building. With UAP, the building can be about 20% bigger, which for this example translates to an additional 2 stories, so long as that difference is permanently affordable housing. Our initial calculations, we found that had UAP been in place since 2014, an additional 20,000 income-restricted affordable homes could have been created and house up to 50,000 New Yorkers. This is assuming that all mixed income and 100% affordable developments would have been a little bit bigger with tax benefits or subsidy in support. Next slide. So what does affordability mean for UAP? DCP is still working with HPD to determine the exact affordability level for UAP, but this framework will achieve deeper affordability levels than existing programs like voluntary inclusionary housing, or VIH, in order to serve lower income New Yorkers. Affordability levels are set through income measures created by the federal government called Area Medium Income, or AMI. The AMI for UAP will be lower than 80%, where the affordability level currently is for VIH. We recognize that 80% AMI doesn't meet the needs of New Yorkers who need affordable housing, especially as AMIs have risen dramatically in recent years. For example, in 2019, 80% AMI for a family of 3 was around $76,000. But today, it's over $100,000, far higher than the incomes of many working class New Yorkers. Next slide. UAP will use lower AMIs than 80%. UAP will also allow for income averaging, meaning a building can include deeply affordable units and serve a much wider range of New York City families. Next slide. So UAP will replace voluntary inclusionary housing, or VIH, and this includes inclusionary housing designated areas, or IHDAs, and R10 districts and equivalents. These are optional zoning tools to incentivize the creation of affordable housing. Under our current regulations, new developments in eligible R10 districts or IHDAs can access increased FARs by providing affordable housing. However, as shown on this map, VIH covers relatively limited parts of the city, UAP will have a larger geographic relevance as it extend an affordable housing preference to all our medium high density districts citywide. UAP has other benefits compared to VIH. VIH set affordability at 80% AMI and did not allow for income averaging, which resulted in a glut of units at 80% AMI. Again, UAP will use a lower AMI level than VIH and allow for income averaging to ensure housing is available to a wider range of incomes. Next slide. Many of you may be familiar with another critical zoning tool for creating affordable housing, mandatory inclusionary housing, or MIH. When an area is rezoned to allow significantly more housing, MIH requires developers to make 20 to 30% of the units affordable. MIH will continue to exist. This means both that existing MIH areas, which are shown here in this map, will remain, and as new rezonings create increases in housing, new MIH areas will be added. In these areas, developers will be required to provide affordable housing in accordance with the MIH option that's mapped in that location. There are some MIH FARs that are lower than UAP FAR for these districts. In these areas, MIH FARs will be raised to match the UAP FARs, but the affordability requirements from MIH will remain in place. Next slide. Now I'm just going to walk through a series of examples to illustrate how UAP works in practice. As a quick note, the yellow portions on these building models just illustrate the additional floor area a developer could build if they included affordable housing, and does not represent where the affordable housing will actually be located. The affordable units would be distributed throughout the building. So in this first example, a developer has a vacant site in an R6 district and plans to build a mixed income building, or a building that has both market rate and affordable units. Today, they get 3.0 FAR, regardless of whether developing market rate or affordable housing. And this will allow them to build about 35 units. Under UAP, they get 3.9 FAR. But note that extra 0.9 FAR can only be used for affordable housing. If it is, they can build about 10 to 12 more affordable units. Now, 10 to 12 more affordable units may not sound like a lot, but this is functioning at a citywide scale. If every project has a few more affordable units, we can add a significant amount of affordable housing, and no single neighborhood will experience drastic changes. Next slide. In our next example, we have a city-owned site in an R8B district that's going to be used for an entirely affordable building. Today, R8B districts do not have a preferential FAR for affordable senior housing. So this site is limited to 47 units, no matter what kind of housing they're providing. We're proposing for R8B districts and all other districts with no existing senior housing preference, or a very small senior housing preference, will receive a 20% bump for affordable housing. In R8B, this means 4.8 FAR for affordable housing. In this example, that translates to an additional 9 to 10 permanently affordable homes. By making sure that every medium and high density zoning district has a preference for affordable housing, we can encourage incremental affordable housing growth throughout the entire city. We also want to make sure that buildings can actually fit this affordable housing, so provide height increases so that the affordable FAR can actually be realized. Next slide. Finally, I'll walk through an example of how this proposal affects a mandatory inclusionary housing area, or an MIH area. Let's say there's a site in an R7A district that was recently rezoned and is subject to MIH. The current maximum MIH FAR is 4.6 FAR, which on this site results in 54 units. Depending on the MIH area, 25 to 30% of the units will be required to be affordable. Because the UAP FAR in R7A districts is 5.0, the MIH FAR will also be raised to 5.0. But the 25 to 30% affordability requirement will remain in place. And this allows for 5 more units. Next slide. Finally, I'm going to present our parking proposals. Our parking mandate changes is also one of our big moves. We'll be making parking optional for new housing everywhere. Parking mandates can be bulky and burdensome, forcing a costly parking supply where it may not be necessary, and at the expense of housing production. since developers may underbuild to avoid triggering high and costly parking requirements. And the diagram on this slide represents how parking takes up a lot of space. 2 parking spaces is the equivalent to the size of a studio apartment, for example. Building parking itself is also very expensive and is an obstacle to housing growth, especially affordable housing. We want to prioritize housing over parking here. Parking will still be allowed, and we anticipate that developers will respond to market needs and continue to provide parking in areas where there is demand. But by removing parking mandates, we can help reduce the cost of housing construction and enable the development of more homes in each new building. Next slide. And I'll walk through an example of how eliminating parking mandates can support housing growth. A developer sees an underutilized lot that's in a great location near a train and wants to convert the lot into an apartment building. Now, this site could fit 16 units, but developer stops at just 10, so they can waive out of the parking requirements. As soon as they add that 11th unit, they would need to provide 6 parking spaces, which just wouldn't fit on this site. By eliminating parking mandates, the developer can now fully build out this lot to include those 6 additional units. Now, again, 6 additional apartments may not seem significant, but when hundreds of sites across the city are able to build more housing, that incremental change results in a lot more housing available to New Yorkers. Next slide. So thanks so much for joining us here for the first of these monthly info sessions. Really looking forward to everybody's questions and comments tonight, and hope that you will come back for our upcoming info sessions about the other elements of the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity text amendment. I'll pass over to Lara.
Thank you, Winnie. Really appreciate your presentation. Now we have a good amount of time to really discuss the details of this proposal some more. Certainly, so we want to continue the conversation. We're going to begin to, sorry, I'm just making sure the screen is working.
We're all right.
Okay. So just wanted to continue the conversation now, and we have plenty of time to ask questions. As a reminder, if you want to ask questions, please use either the Q&A function. I can see there's some questions already building in there. Or if you'd like to raise your hand on the bottom right-hand part of your screen, there's a button you can push that says raise hand. That if you push that will put you into the queue. And if you are on the phone, please use *9, and that will raise your hand. So I don't see any raised hands, so I'm going to start with some of the questions in the chat. Right. So some of the questions that I just wanted to acknowledge first are just logistical ones. So will this presentation be accessible on your website? It will 100% be on our website as soon as tomorrow. So you will be able to rewatch it and send us questions even through our email address. So you'll have that there. One of the questions here is how can young people really help in the engagement? So I'll let the team get to that. I do see John Mangan is on now. John, if you just want to introduce yourself.
Hi, folks. I'm John Mangan, Director of the Housing Division here at City Planning, and thanks to everybody for coming out. Yeah, so
we're doing engagement across the city on City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. We've been going to different youth engagement programs as well throughout the city. So if there's something that, or organization or a event that you think would be really a great place for us to be able to talk to youth more about this and get them to even participate in these info sessions, please drop in the Q&A or email us and let us know, and we'd be more than happy to engage some more on that end. So we're here to listen to your questions. We're here to also find out more places that we can make sure that we're reaching New Yorkers of all generations. So the next question that I see in the chat, can you put up charts of density and height increases by zoning district?
That's a great question. This is publicly available information. The very least we can do right now is I can have someone from the team provide a link to the draft scope of work for the proposal. And there's a section in there on the UAP proposal that goes into excruciating detail on every single zoning district, what the existing FARs are, what the proposed ones are, every single zoning district, what the existing heights are, what the proposals are. And we can give you the link and the page numbers to that in the chat so everybody can look at it. I don't know if this session is a time to put up that extremely complicated chat on the screen, but we can I can ask my team if they can do that as well.
Yeah, so I think we definitely should dive into that. I think we have it on our website. We'd love for you to look at it there, send us questions about it. And we can dive in a little bit more on a case-by-case basis as well, if that's helpful. So I'm gonna go, I still don't see any hands raised. So I'm gonna go to, let's see. Somebody expressing excitement about permanently affordable housing. Is this imperative to preserve communities? That is imperative to preserve communities. So either one of you want to just talk a little bit about what does it mean to be permanently affordable?
Sure. One of the great things about zoning is that we can make permanent affordability requirements that are difficult or impossible to do when you're merely providing subsidy for a project. The way that the UAP framework works is if you want to take advantage of that additional floor area for affordable housing, then that additional floor area absolutely has to remain affordable at qualifying AMIs for the life of that building. So there is no way that you can build that bigger building and then at some point in the future convert that to something other than permanently affordable housing. And that's one of the reasons why we're very excited to extend this framework across all medium and high density districts. As Winnie related, today we only have that framework in a very small percentage of those areas, about 13%. If and when we pass this, that framework will exist across 100% of medium and high density areas in a way that will produce a ton of income restricted housing in the years ahead.
Thank you, John. So there are a few hands that are raised now. So I will go to the first raised hand.
Our first speaker is Daughtry Karstoffen, followed by Fanny Chang, followed by Olive Freud.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my question. I actually put my questions in the chat. The first one is for undertaking this notable and truly needed change. I'm wondering, one, why you're setting the threshold at a 20% bonus, which exists currently, as you mentioned, in MIH districts. And two, why the threshold for defining affordability is set at 80% AMI when we all know that true affordability really exists at 50% AMI and lower. Those are the two key questions. And then eventually, if you wouldn't mind explaining income averaging, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. So just to clarify for UAP, we're looking at affordability levels that are lower than 80% AMI. We recognize that number was on the slide, so definitely understand where that confusion is coming from. So we think we can do a lot better than 80% AMI for UAP. We're still working with HPD to determine what exactly AMI levels we'll be using. And to explain income averaging, so how that works is like whatever number we decide on, we can reach that target AMI level by balancing out with lower AMI households that may be below that target number and balancing out with higher AMI households that are above it. So we'll average out to reach that final number. So this way we can reach a wider range of households rather than just marketing towards, for VIH, for example, just 80% AMI households.
And Winnie, I just want to pause on that just to underscore how fantastic a change this is. Today, the voluntary inclusionary programs produce units at 80% and only 80%. If you're not a family that earns, 79 to 81% AMI or whatever, then you're not going to be able to qualify for those units. By enabling affordable units at a range of incomes, we can serve a much wider range of New York City families, including folks way down at that, 40%, 30% AMI that we just don't hit with the voluntary inclusionary programs today. As for your question about, the fact that it's about a 20% preferential FAR in most districts, there are some districts where it's more. 20% is just the minimum. And the reason why the preference is what it is across those districts is because it just clicks into the existing zoning framework. We're just taking the zoning as it is, leaving market rate floor area where it is, and then floating affordable and supportive FARs up to the senior affordable level. So by piggybacking on the existing zoning framework, we can expand across the entire geography at once, rather than trying to create something new from scratch, which would be a much broader and more disruptive undertaking. So we're very excited about this approach and what it can mean.
Thank you, John. Let's take another raised hand.
Our next speaker is Fanny Chang.
Hi, Fanny, are you there?
Fanny, you may be seeing a notice on your screen asking you to accept promotion to panelist. I can also give you permission to unmute now. You should be able to turn on your mic. I think Fanny may have declined or may have stepped away.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let's come back to Fanny Chang. Can we go to Olive Freud? Olive?
One moment. Olive, you should be able to turn on your microphone. I think Olive is having difficulties connecting. We can come back.
Okay.
Okay. No, you still can't hear me.
Olive, I can hear you. Yes.
Oh, you can hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Well, the basic question I want to ask is, we're talking about the densest city in the country, and you're talking about putting more density into that city. That's not very thoughtful. But we do need affordable housing. And is there another way of doing it? For the most important is not to lose any that you have now. And you are losing it.
Mhm.
The rules just don't work all the time. The regulations just seem to slip away and we can't keep them. There's no doubt the city is becoming for the very wealthy, and we keep losing affordable housing. And that's where you should be talking about. That's what you should be talking about. And also, it's such a bad idea to put more density into this city and into this world. It's just not what's needed when you consider global warming.
Thank you, Olive. We really appreciate your comments. Maybe team, you can just talk a little bit about how important it is for us to have a diversity of housing.
Sure. Definitely. Thanks for those comments and questions, Olive. We completely agree that housing costs in New York City are out of control, that, displacement pressures and gentrification are out of control. We're seeing overcrowding. We're seeing proliferation of informal, housing types. We're seeing, homelessness on a really horrible scale. And all of those things are driven by the housing shortage, the fact that there is not enough housing in New York City. So if we say, and this is all outlined in Where We Live, the city's fair housing report from a couple years ago, out of which these proposals emerge. If we throw our hands up and say, New York City, it's so crowded, we're out of room, no more people, and just cap the amount of housing that we have in the city, we are condemning, the city to an even worse housing cost increases, even higher displacement and gentrification. When we cap housing like that, and when there's not enough, people at the lower end of the income scale really suffer the most. And so, because we agree with you that housing costs are out of control, that, displacement pressures are out of control, we are doing what we can to enable a little more housing across the widest possible geography so that we can actually create a lot of new housing. We can change the feel of the housing market for tenants, for young people looking to buy their first home, for old people looking to age in place, without changing the neighborhood character wherever it is you live, or without overtaxing infrastructure. So that's the key of the broad geographic approach and the incremental approach. This is not dramatically changing the zoning in any neighborhood. It's just a little bit everywhere. You mentioned global warming. You mentioned climate change. We agree with you completely that this is one of our top planning priorities in New York City. And that's why another City of Yes initiative, the first one out of three, was City of Yes for carbon neutrality, that reoriented New York City zoning to do what it can in order to reduce carbon emissions from the city and address some of the global warming issues that we're facing in increasing years. But the housing piece is also super important to this. Did you know that New York City residents have the least carbon intensive lives of basically anybody in the country, in the continent, maybe the world? Because we live relatively densely, because we have a great transit system, because we have great access to jobs and everything like that, we don't emit the carbon that somebody who has to drive 20 miles to work and back every day, or has to drive to the grocery store, things like that. So if you're concerned about climate change, and if you're concerned about carbon emissions, the absolute best thing that you can do is build more housing in a place like New York City, where more people can, take public transit to jobs, things like that. More people can walk to the grocery store. And so while we're talking mostly about housing costs and things like that, and the pressures that people face in this soul crusher of a housing market, the environmental aspects of the housing opportunity proposals are also really important. So thank you for those comments and questions.
Thanks, John. Let's go to the next raised hand. We have Sue-Lin.
Hi, thank you. I'm looking at the latest census numbers from the ACS census estimates by community district on a website called censusreporter.org. And for my community district, which is Community District 9 in Brooklyn, our population as of the end of 2022 stands at 94,000, which is below where it was in 2010 and significantly below where it was in the year 2000. But meanwhile, since 2010, we've built 3,500 units of housing, and we've got another 2,900 permitted in the pipeline, including, and I think that doesn't even include about 1,000 units of very low income housing that are slated to be built under Vital Brooklyn. So I'm struggling to understand what the purpose of creating more housing is. I mean, I can't speak to other districts, but I do know that overall, New York City's population is down significantly in the last few years to 8.35 million. And I just, I when we're looking at something like the UMAP, most of my district is covered by these higher density zoning districts. We would see several thousand more units being built, and I don't understand the purpose of that if we don't even have as much population as we did 10 years ago, but we have 3,500 more and counting units of housing.
Thank you.
And we are making attempts to build the genuinely low income housing. And, obviously we're very concerned about our rent stabilized housing. That is the majority of our housing units.
Thanks, Sue-Lin. John, I think you were.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for those comments. We have seen our population rebound as we continue to emerge from the pandemic. Another thing we've seen emerging from the pandemic is people consuming more housing. That is, people are working from home now. So people who may have been content with a one bedroom in the past or share a two bedroom with a roommate or whatever, people who can are now taking a two bedroom themselves and using the other bedroom for a home office or something like that. Now, not everybody's doing that, of course, but if enough people do something like that, then it increases pressure on the housing market in a way that has the same effect of a lot of people, moving to New York City and looking for housing. Puts upward pressure on rents, increases that gentrification and displacement pressure as people go farther and farther out into New York looking for housing that they can afford, leads to overcrowding, leads to homelessness and everything else. And you can really see this in New York City's vacancy rate, for instance. It's still, at emergency levels under state law. It's still like about 4% or even less for apartments that are, lower in rent. And when the housing market is that tight, when tenants just don't have options, then, that's an indicator that we need to create more housing so that tenants actually have options, so that landlords can't, raise rent with impunity, so that, the market just feels different. And so that's what we're trying to do. And it's a combination of population rebound and people consuming more housing. But every indicator is clear there that if we, stop building housing, as you suggest, what's the point? That we would supercharge those rent increases, supercharge the gentrification and displacement pressure that a lot of neighborhoods are facing. And, you know, and I can say, you know, your neighborhood, Community District 9 in Brooklyn, is a neighborhood that's seen a lot of development. And I can say that this proposal is for neighborhoods like that, that are seeing a lot of development, some might say a disproportionate amount of development under the status quo. That happens because there are so many parts of the city where development can't happen. And so people and so development gets pushed into a few different areas, you know, like PLG. You know, you see it in East Flatbush. I see questions in the chat from East Flatbush. You see it in, you know, parts of the Rockaways. You see it in parts of, you know, Bedford Park, different parts of the city. By enabling a little more housing everywhere, we will be taking pressure off of the neighborhoods, the parts of the city that see a disproportionate amount of, you know, development or displacement gentrification pressure today. So it's another reason why we're excited to be taking a citywide approach. So thanks for those comments.
Thank you, John. Let's take another hand, Justine, and then we'll go into the chat for the Q&A function.
Thanks so much. Sorry about that. It took me a minute to figure out how to unmute. So thanks for calling on me. So I have two questions. One is a simple one. With the City of Yes and the UA, of course now I'm forgetting what it's called, but the UA, is it also going to apply to office conversions? Because I'm in Community Board 1 in Manhattan. So high density, loss of so much affordable housing, but we are kind of built up already, except for the empty office buildings and empty hotels.
Thank you, Justine. I was just reading a question similar to this in the chat, so.
That was mine.
Oh, it's yours. Okay. Perfect. So yeah, John, Winnie, if you
Sure.
could just talk about office conversions, and it's just to reiterate what you wrote in the chat, is this just for new buildings?
Yeah, so the way that our existing conversions framework applies, non-residential buildings in the geography where it applies can convert to residential regardless of FAR.
Mm-hmm.
We agree with you, and we are looking to expand that framework citywide to move the cutoff date from 1961 or 1977 in parts of your community district all the way up to 1990, and to enable conversion to the full range of housing types, including supportive housing, you know, shared housing, dorms, things like that. But
Yep.
we're gonna cover that in a future info session. We
Got it.
agree with you completely that we want and need affordable housing in conversions. And that's why one of the city's main legislative priorities right now, as we speak, is to advocate for a tax incentive at the state level to support affordability in office conversions.
Mhm.
We don't have the local authority. The city does not have the local authority to do that ourselves. And so we are working with, you know, counterparts and colleagues at the state level in order to make that happen so that when we get conversions, we will get a solid percentage of affordable housing at good AMIs in there. I also want to say, just one more point, that we are increasing the flexibility of the conversions framework such that we expect to see some conversions to 100% affordable buildings, like supportive housing, things like that, which would be subsidized by our housing department, HPD. And that's another exciting way that we can't get affordability in conversions today, but we are hopeful we will be able to get affordability in conversions tomorrow. So great question.
That makes sense. Can I do a follow-up question? Is that all right?
Fine by me. Taylor?
Yeah,
I
sure.
don't want to be rude, but so I guess one comment comment and then a question. So one comment's going to be, I appreciate that the 80% AMI or lower is something that is necessary. My gosh, 40% of AMI is necessary to get people housed. But it depends on the neighborhood. So you do 40% of AMI or you do 80% of AMI, again, in Lower Manhattan, we've lost affordable housing because 421A has expired. And you're you're gentrifying Lower Manhattan in the opposite way, because there's too many people here who make more than that, but yet can't afford to stay here. So what I guess I would look to you to say is, what about the people who are working in the service industry, whether they're the doormen, the teachers, the police officers, the firemen, the secretaries in different, corporate world? Instead of enforcing them to take, those are folks that actually have to show up in person, COVID, no COVID, they're not going to be able to do office work from home. What about creating homes and places for them so that they also can be permanently in a neighborhood where they're working and stuff like that? So that would be one thing for you guys to consider as you're doing this. And it's very different, because what you're going to do in Lower Manhattan is going to be very different than what you're going to do in the Bronx or Brooklyn. And I think that distinction is something that you guys need to, well, I would encourage you to pay attention to. You don't need to do anything, but I would look at that as a distinction. And then I throw this out to you, which is like a pipe dream, but I'm part of the Coalition for 100% Affordability at 5 World Trade Center. And we've now managed with our advocacy to get up to 33% affordable. I believe that, again, it's at 5 World Trade Center, so it's Lower Manhattan. I believe that the AMI percentage is maybe 100 or 120. I don't recall off the top of my head, but there's a preference for survivors of 9/11 because it's the World Trade Center. But I would ask to see what, if anything, can be done to help put more people there, and why. It's expensive in Lower Manhattan to put people, yeah? But there's infrastructure here. We have schools. We have a lot of stuff that is there. So I throw that just out to you as a thought.
Great. All right. Thanks for those. I'll take them in order. Agree with you completely that we do not want to create affordable units just at one AMI, even if that's a really low AMI. We know housing costs in New York City are out of control, and we want to create affordable units for families at a range of incomes. I appreciate that you are reminding us and everybody on this call that, sometimes higher AMIs are appropriate for families who would not otherwise be able to live in a given neighborhood. Even though people get most excited about those lower AMIs, let's not forget about, higher AMIs higher up the chain. I know Community Board 4 in Manhattan, for instance, is always really good at reminding folks of this, that, hey, people of somewhat higher incomes need help as well. That's why we're super excited to be enabling income averaging through UAP, so that we will create affordable units at a range of incomes from very, very, and even extremely low AMIs, a little bit higher up the income chain in a way that serves, not just folks who can't work for whatever reason, but also the service industry employees, city employees, and other folks like that. So thanks for that point. UAP is just one component. We'll talk at next info session about what we're doing in some lower density areas of New York. We're excited to be enabling, missing middle, modest multifamily housing there that will create opportunities on the margin for affordable units, affordable rental, and affordable home ownership, which tends to work better at a lower scale in areas like that. As far as 5 World Trade Center goes, it sounds like you have a sense of that as well. To do 100% affordable at 5 World Trade Center would basically take all of the city's affordable housing subsidy, in one project. And we do need to make sure that we are using that equitably, using that efficiently too, to create that affordable unit on the 100th floor or whatever. That's going to cost millions and millions of dollars that could create, 10 or more affordable units in a different form of construction or in different parts of the city. So, it's all about balance, although we really appreciate your advocacy around that and congratulate you on some of your victories there.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Justine. We're gonna move to the Q&A questions. So please feel free to use that again. You just need to drop your question into the Q&A function, and I'll be able to answer it live for you. I do want to say there's been a lot of questions about the view that many of you are seeing the ASL interpreter only. If you go to the top right corner of your screen, you can change the view to be gallery, and then you can see all of us. Hopefully that works for you. But yes, the ASL interpreter is pinned, so that if people need to have the interpretation, it is always on screen, but use the gallery view, and that will help you to be able to see all of us. So Winnie, John, there's some clarifying questions about the presentation. The first example that you talked about, how does the 10 feet taller restriction work with 2 additional floors within the UAP?
Yeah, thanks for the clarifying question. So the idea here is that we're going to be allowing for additional height if there's a need for that to accommodate the additional floor area we're giving for developments that are doing affordable or supportive. We may not necessarily need that height, but there's some sites that are smaller or have irregular shapes that may necessarily need additional heights in order to fit that additional floor area that we're giving through UAP, the Universal Affordability Preference.
Right. And if you look at that table, I hope that we've sent the link out to the draft scope of work as Sue Wen requested. If you look at the table, I think it's like on page 15 or something like that, you can see that many districts have no height increase. They already have an envelope capable of accommodating the floor area. Some have 10 feet or 1 story. Few have 20 feet or 2 stories. And I think there are even 2 districts that may require 3 stories or 30 feet in order to provide flexibility for some of those more challenging sites that Winnie mentioned. Again, we don't want to give an amount of affordable housing that ultimately folks can't fit within the heights that are allowed in that district. We want to make sure that those things work together.
Thank you. So this is a question again about just clarifying. Winnie, you mentioned a test case for city-owned properties zoned R8, where the proposed legislation would allow an overall height increase of 30 feet. Within the proposed legislation, is that a standard height increase across all R6 through R10 properties, or are there other considerations that would go into that calculation?
Yeah, great question. There definitely were other considerations that went into that calculation. It's not a standard height increase across all our medium and high density districts. So when we were looking about what the new height increases would be, we wanted to make sure that the height was created to fit the floor area that's allowed. So some districts, like for example, R8B, which is the one we use in the example, had really restrictive building envelopes. And so they needed slightly larger height increases than some other districts that already had more flexible building envelopes and didn't need such a dramatic increase to fit the additional floor area that would be giving for affordable and supportive housing.
Yeah, I think we worked with our urban design division on that. And the idea is to enable the allotted amount of affordable housing, even on an interior lot that is not on a corner that tends to be more flexible, and to provide also a little bit of flexibility in there for things like architectural expression, so that we're not just creating a bunch of flat boxes everywhere. And so that gives you a glimpse into some of the thinking that went into those envelopes that we're proposing.
Thank you both for that clarification. The next couple questions are related to parking. And so the first one is talking about there has been places in the United States where we have eliminated parking mandates already. Can you talk a little bit about the effect of this change in those other cities as case studies?
Yeah, great questions. Definitely happy to talk more about the parking mandate changes. So we've been working really closely with our transportation division here, and they've been doing studies for what other cities have done that have already chosen to provide no parking for their housing. And so if they found for developments that were created after those changes were made to those parking mandates, that some developments still provided parking, and some provided as much or more than what was previously required. And we actually have lots of areas in New York City today where parking is optional, and developments continue to provide parking where it's needed, or not parking at all. The idea here for the parking proposal is that right now it's a barrier to our housing growth. So we just want to remove it as an obstacle to creating more housing opportunities in New York City.
Thank you, Winnie. That answered a lot of the questions that I see here.
And I would say too, like, parking is one of the areas where it's kind of like a silver lining that New York City is so far behind other places in the country, because we can look to those other places and see what's happened there. And like when he says, it's not the case that nobody provides parking anymore. In fact, many developers continue to provide parking. It's just that parking no longer absolutely prohibits housing from being built on sites where it might be difficult to provide, either for space reasons or for money reasons. So, and like when he says, we see developers in places like, Eastern Queens or South Brooklyn already providing more parking than is required by the zoning. And so, this won't affect developments like that. Knock yourselves out. Those areas will continue to provide parking because they think that will be an asset to their tenants or the people who buy those units. We expect that to continue in the future.
To that point, one of the other questions is just thinking about availability of public transit that affects the parking requirement. So can you just talk a little bit about like how, just how we think about parking when it comes to like transit zones? You mentioned a little bit about the fact that like in Eastern Queens, we might see people still using building parking spaces. Just what do you think around transit areas?
Yeah, we think that transit access will definitely play a factor for developers when they're determining whether or not to add parking to their projects. But right now, again, like for our parking mandate proposal, parking is going to be optional for all new housing citywide. It's not dependent on transit access. But again, like I think transit access will still play a part for where we will see new parking being added in the city. And for example, in areas like Eastern Queens or other parts of the city that are further away from our transit hubs.
Great. So this question goes to the area median income. Is there a percentage of the area median income, which is also known as AMI, or ballpark figure of what percentage of DCP is aiming for?
Yeah, great question. Happy to reiterate this. So the idea here is that we can do better than the 80% AMI that the VIH Voluntary Inclusionary Housing Program currently defines as affordable, because we recognize 80% AMI is really out of step with New Yorkers' actual household incomes. The exact AMI levels are still to be determined and be released in the coming months as we get closer to our referral. But right now we think we can do lower than 80% AMI. And we'll also allow for income averaging, of course, so that we can reach a broader range of households.
Okay, let's do a couple more written because we have a good amount of questions in the chat. And then we'll go back to some raised hands. So please be patient. We want to make sure we're getting to everybody in the most comfortable way that they feel like expressing their question. Not sure if this would happen. However, if you use an MIH, at 30% and using the UAP would increase the MIH to a rate higher than 30%, what would apply? The total of both programs or just the MIH program? So I'm sorry, I think you probably got that, but I just want to clarify. It's basically asking, is MIH and UAP, can you combine those both programs into one?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it gets really tricky when we're introducing a new program and interactions with existing programs. So for the example that we walked through, for example, like an R7A district, the current max MIH FAR for that district is 4.6. But the UAP FAR that we're proposing for R7A districts is higher than the max MIH FAR, so it'd be 5.0. So we're saying for developments that are happening in a mapped MIH area that want to take advantage of the UAP framework, they can access that higher FAR 5.0, but they'll still have to be producing the affordable units according to the MIH requirements. So for that example, it looks like you're referring to MIH option 2. So they would do 30% of the floor area would have to be about 80% AMI or lower.
But yeah, they're basically either or. If you're in a mandatory inclusionary housing area, affordable housing is absolutely mandatory. You have to provide it to build anything at all. UAP exists outside of MIH areas. It's voluntary. Under our UAP proposal, you get what you get today, market rate wise. If you want to go bigger, you have to provide permanently affordable housing. And so it's a voluntary framework. So in areas where MIH applies, affordable housing isn't voluntary. Outside of it, the UAP framework applies.
Great. So the next couple questions are based on tax abatements. Will there be a tax abatement paired with this to subsidize the affordable requirements? And also just to ask the next question, if you get a new version of the expired 421A, which is the tax exemption, how will this interact with UAP?
Great and absolutely crucial questions. The UAP framework that we've laid out today, of course, it will enable 100% affordable projects subsidized by HPD to be a little bigger across the full range of medium and high density districts. But it'll really produce a lot of additional income restricted housing if we can make it work for privately financed developments as well. That is, developments that don't require HPD to pony up, millions of dollars in order to build them. For that, you're absolutely correct. We will need a tax benefit in some form to support affordable housing. That's what 421A did in the past. And the city is advocating with our state colleagues and counterparts for a renewal in some form of a tax benefit that will work in conjunction with UAP to produce, like when he said, tens of thousands of affordable housing units in the decade ahead, as long as they can work together. In the absence of a tax benefit for multifamily housing, we don't expect to see much, if any, mixed income rental at all. And so that's why, the administration is working with folks at the state level to get a renewal, hopefully at, truly affordable AMIs.
Thank you. So we're gonna do one more question. So New York City's infrastructure has not been addressed in nearly a century. How do you plan to build more housing, overpopulate a burdened city when the infrastructure is falling apart?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and definitely feedback that we've been hearing throughout our engagement process for this text amendment. So just want to emphasize the idea of this for City of Yester housing opportunity is that we're promoting a little more housing in every neighborhood. Like John mentioned, the approach that we're taking here is a citywide approach, but also an incremental housing growth approach. So the idea is that every neighborhood has to do our part to meeting our housing need, our housing crisis. So we don't expect this to have an overwhelming effect on our existing infrastructure the way some of our more ground up rezonings have, though we are working with our partner agencies to ensure that capital investments are planned according to future demand. But yeah, definitely hear that comment.
And we're in the midst of environmental review right now, where we're analyzing the potential effects of this proposal across a range of impact categories, everything from open space to water and sewer, things like that across, the full across different types of neighborhoods across the city. And so that also informs, what we'll do in order to support a little more housing growth in every neighborhood across the city.
All right, let's go to some raised hands. I see Fanny at the top of the list again. I wanted to make sure we weren't able to get to you before, so let's see if we can hopefully hear from you now.
Fanny, you should be able to turn on your microphone. Fanny's declined the promotion. But Fanny, you still should be able to turn on the mic if you would like to speak. If you can't turn on your microphone, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to type in your question. I think Fanny may be having technical difficulties.
Okay. All right, Fanny, we'll try to reach out to you to see if we can get you on the call. Let's move to Ken. Hi, Ken. You can unmute yourself.
Whoops, sorry, I thought that was done.
No worries. I do
Sorry
it all
about
the
that.
time. I did it at the top of the hour, actually.
Following your lead. So I have two questions, please. One is regarding the uncoupling of any parking mandates. It seems to me that that there's not necessarily going to be an increase in available space for residential units, because if there is a building that did have parking that is being reconstructed, those former parking spaces would in effect either not be available, or it would increase their production cost and time due to sorry, it's the end of the day, due to remediation necessities. So that's one question. How do you get the net increase in available units when you're building on parcels that will need remediation? That's one. And the other question I have is about the income averaging. If you have a building that can have a breadth of different AMIs that are being subsidized, then are you taking an average or a mean to meet the 80% threshold? Because, for example, if you had a building with 3 units, one at 100% of AMI and 2 units at 10% of AMI, you have an average AMI of 40, but you have a mean AMI of 10. So are there any stipulations or strictures about how you can do the income averaging? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Gotcha. Maybe I'll do income averaging first. So we actually have income averaging already. It's in the MIH program only, however. And so we're trying to extend it to all medium and high density district areas. The way that it works is because we are not trying to drive our colleagues at HPD, the housing agency, completely nuts. Typically, a development that wants to use income averaging can pick 3 different income bands so that it reduces the amount of complexity. You do not have 10 units, each of which are at a different income band. And it is the average based on overall floor area. So, if you had 1 unit at 40, similar size unit at 60, and a similar size unit at 80, that would be an average of 60% AMI. If the 40% AMI unit is really small and the 80% AMI is really big, then that would weight the average towards the 80%. If you want to look into the details, it's in 2390 of the zoning resolution for how income averaging works. As far as the uncoupling of the parking mandates go, your parking question, we should say this proposal will not eliminate parking requirements for existing buildings. It'll provide a pathway involving public review to do that if there are developments with existing parking that want to use their parking lots for other stuff, new housing or garden or whatever. There are developments that have largely empty parking lots that might want to do something like that. Then they would have to go through a discretionary approval process that would involve environmental review, would involve public meetings and would involve decision making by a public entity, most likely the city planning commission. So just want to say we're not going to wave a magic wand and remove the requirements for existing buildings, parking lots that have tenants, using them already. Though we will create a pathway for that.
Thanks, John. Team, can we go to DJ?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, environmental review was mentioned briefly. I actually just wanted to get a more detailed overview of what the environmental impact statement or review process is like for City of Yes. And I'll say I'm a supporter, so how to prevent it from becoming a drawn out thing with too many people giving input and it taking years and years to go through the system. Thank you.
Thanks, TJ. Yes, this is probably the largest environmental review that the city has ever engaged in, with a team of dozens of folks from HPD working on it, with a number of consultants to analyze the proposal across the range of impact categories that you'll see in the Seeker technical manual. Open space, school seats, sewer and water, construction, socioeconomic impacts. You can look up the list in the Seeker technical manual. But we are looking to publish that EIS. I should say we are also looking at it across many different types of neighborhoods, from low density areas to high density areas, from wealthy neighborhoods to lower income neighborhoods. There are just a number of parameters along which we want to get good representation for that environmental review. And then we would publish that all in a draft environmental impact statement at the time that this is referred into public review, which will be in a few months at this point. And then, the beauty of the uniform land use review procedure, if you're somebody, it sounds like you are, who's concerned about how long things like this take, is that it's on a clock. This isn't ULURP technically, but it's similar to it. It would go to the community boards. It'll go to borough president, borough boards. It'll go to the city planning commission, and then it'll go to city council, all of which have a clock. And so, once it's referred into public review, it's not going to take 2 years or anything like that. It's on the clock in order to make sure that we're adequately preparing folks. We're having meetings like this and have had over 100 meetings with, stakeholders, council members, some community boards as well. We just want to make sure that when it is formally enters into public review, that everybody's ready for it and that no one's surprised what's in it, so that we can have formal public engagement at that time too.
Thank you, John. Can we go to the next raised hand, Michael? Hi, Michael, can you hear us?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. I had a two-part question around the city-owned lots. Curious to hear what the proposed development model is. The plan to sell, the city would sell lots to developers, and then with obviously with the condition of 100% affordable housing, or is there a city or other government organization that's going to be either doing the development or managing kind of long-term, say NYCHA, HUD, et cetera. And then second question, kind of along that, I think, John, you mentioned in an answer to a previous question, without some sort of tax incentive, you wouldn't see a lot of the mixed income developments being realistic. Is there current tax incentive or plans for those 100% city-owned properties?
Yeah, thanks for your question. So just to clarify, the idea behind this isn't a development plan. It's just about the text amendment is about addressing the barriers in our zoning to create for more housing opportunities. So for that particular example, it was like theoretically, if we had a city-owned lot and the city were working with an affordable housing developer and wanted to do 100% affordable, what they could do with UAP. And we've been speaking to a lot of different affordable housing developers, and they've been excited about UAP in particular because they're already doing 100% affordable, and this will allow them to do bigger buildings and produce more affordable and supportive units. So that's the first part of that. And then for tax incentives, like John mentioned, that's state level. We're working really closely with our state colleagues to advocate to see a replacement 420A program so that we can see more mixed income developments take advantage of the UAP framework, because otherwise it's unlikely we'll see those types of mixed income developments without some sort of replacement.
Right. Yeah, we love our publicly owned lots just because it gives our sister agency, HPD, the ability to, make 100% affordable developments in a way that you can't, demand if it's a purely privately owned site, and to, carefully shape an affordability program that works for the neighborhoods where those lots are. You mentioned NYCHA. We are also looking at the range of NYCHA sites. I know that in my role at city planning, I've worked on dozens and dozens of mayoral zoning overrides for NYCHA, where the zoning doesn't work for them to do, say, 100% affordable senior infill on an empty parking lot. And so they have to go through a big, long process. We're trying to adjust the regulations so that, it's easier for NYCHA to do what they want to do on their sites as well, which again tends to be those 100% affordable development infill there, that in some cases they partner with others in order to build and maintain over time.
Thank you. Can we go to Layla?
Hello, everyone. Good to see you. Thank you so much for this robust outreach that you're doing. It's really much appreciated. I have a quick question. I represent Community Board 5 in Manhattan. We are the most high-value land in the city, probably in the country, probably in the world. As a result, because of land costs, it is very, very difficult for developers to actually develop affordable housing, which is the reason why we have actually seen 0 units built under MIH. Would you consider, given the nature of our district, would you consider creating a zoning that would actually incentivize social housing rather than affordable housing that relies on private capital?
Thanks for that question, Layla. You're absolutely right. Community Board 5, because of high land costs, because of the fact that much of it is zoned right up against that state cap, makes it impossible for us to rezone in many places for more housing in a way that would enable us to apply affordability mandates through the MIH program. So I'll say another thing that we're advocating at the state level is to give us a little room to lift that cap, that 12 FAR cap, so that we can rezone the highest density parts of New York, where appropriate, for additional housing, and implement affordability mandates through MIH so that you could see MIH units in the future. We are just zoning, we're regulatory, we're not transactional, we don't give anybody any money. And so generally we have to apply a uniform set of rules for, privately financed sites, for publicly subsidized sites, for things like social housing. And so it's absolutely necessary for us to create, allowances through the zoning, such as we propose through the housing opportunity text amendments here, to enable opportunities for social housing, among other types of housing. But there aren't really legal ways for us regulatorily through the zoning to say things like, you can do social housing here, but you can't do other forms of housing. But we're working closely as well with our sister agency, again, HPD, to support things like, they have a pilot around community land trusts, for instance, where we'll create some of those and we'll learn about them as well in a model that we hope to adapt more broadly in the future.
Should we go into our next raised hand, Lara? I think you might be on mute.
See, this is what's happening. Sorry, team, if we could go to Lucy.
Hello, hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Lucy.
Hi, I put a number of questions in the Q&A. Shoot, and now they're not showing up. Can you see them? Oh, there you are. Boy, I can see you now. You weren't showing up before. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So, one question was about the mandatory parking. Can you see that question?
I'm looking for it right now.
Q&A, there weren't that, I put a number of things in the Q&A. Let's see.
Do you want me to help you out?
Did you see it?
So I don't see them in maybe the order that you're thinking of, but let me just pull some out that I see right now.
I put four questions or comments in the Q&A. But anyway, people have cars for many reasons. And even and as you know, there's many areas that do not have accessible transportation where people have no choice. And even where you have accessible transportation, it doesn't mean that you don't have use for a car for work or travel or to visit your relatives or, for so many reasons that people have cars. So the other thing is where the cars are parked now is either below ground or at ground level, and you don't want to put people there in the dark. I heard the possibility of windowless studios, and that's not a good idea. And what you should really be concentrating on is making sure that you have charging stations to support electric cars. You can't deny that people are going to want to have cars. And if you don't have parking there, then they're going to be searching the neighborhoods where there's already limited parking. We already have people circling and circling looking for a parking place, and you're just going to add to that congestion, air pollution, noise pollution, because people are beeping their horns all the time nowadays. Right. So it doesn't make sense to remove mandatory parking. We really need it. And it's also desired I hear people want to get cars off the street. So this is the opposite of that. You need to have parking in the garages, under the buildings, not putting people in the dark in windowless studios or on the ground floor where they can't open their windows or their curtains because they have constant traffic walking by and looking in their windows. It just doesn't make sense. And I heard the figure that it's expensive for developers to build parking. I don't understand. It's just an open space and not having to put in kitchens and bathrooms, etc. It should be relatively cheap. And again, the focus should be on supporting electric car ownership because we don't have many charging spaces within the city, and very few, and unless you live in the areas where you have a private home and garage and parking lot, it's very hard to charge your car. And it's expensive in the city as well. Anyway, that should be the focus. That was one of my questions.
Lucy,
but I had go
Thank
ahead.
you so much.
Why don't we
Yeah.
start there? I did find your questions in the chat as well, so I'm gonna I can read those off for you as well to make it easier. John, do you want to start with with that one?
Sure, I'll give it a try. We actually just did a big citywide text amendment, City of Yes for carbon neutrality, that dramatically expanded our ability to provide charging stations at a range of locations, including, residential districts, commercial districts, manufacturing districts that are open to the public in order to, encourage and support electric car ownership. So we're really excited about that. And we agree with you on that and have done something very recently about that. We hear you on what a pain in the butt it is, to own a car in New York City if, you don't have an off-street parking space that's all your own. What we're trying to do here is not to like drag people kicking and screaming out of their cars or say that having a car is bad. We recognize that people need cars for a range of reasons, as you say. We are just trying to rebalance the current relationship between parking and housing, where parking requirements prevent housing from being built in the first place, even in parts of the city that are, a 2 or 3 minute walk from a subway. And that's out of whack. We do recognize, again, that it is a pain in the butt to be a car owner who's looking for parking, going around, the block, beeping your horn and everything like that. But we're also extremely focused on the hardships of there not being enough housing. And when we're talking about housing, we're talking about life and death issues for people in the city. We're talking about issues of survival. And so, like I said, we're trying to rebalance that relationship between parking and housing so that, excessive parking requirements in the zoning resolution don't prevent us from building housing that's necessary in order to address that range of human consequences of the housing shortage that we opened this whole meeting with. So thanks for those comments.
And just to quickly add, the text amendment is not proposing windowless bedrooms by any means. Like we are still, you need a window in a bedroom. That's in our housing code and regulations. So for example, you're also speaking a little bit about how building parking may not be that expensive. For the underground parking garages I'm referring to, it's very expensive to like excavate that ground and that earth to produce that parking garage. And we've been in our outreach, I think there was a question about our engagement process. We've been speaking to practitioners, and sometimes they're saying how they have these empty above ground parking garages that are completely empty because the residents are just not using it because these are transit accessible neighborhoods that they're building in that they're being forced to provide parking. So these are examples, real world examples in New York City where we are over mandating a parking supply, which could very well have been used towards producing more housing. So thank you for your comments, Lucy.
Yeah, sorry if our graphic was a little confusing by superimposing 2 parking spots on a studio apartment. We were just trying to represent like how much space parking takes up in addition to how much money it costs as part of the equation and why, parking can interfere with producing more housing.
I do want to acknowledge some of the questions that she did, that Lucy asked in the chat as well. One of them is really based around like the idea of AMI versus local medium income. We talked about this earlier, but if John, you want to just say a little bit of just like how we use the AMI?
Right. I mean, area median income is just a number that defines, at what affordability levels the apartments that you provide are at. It doesn't on its own create any affordable housing or anything like that. It's a number that enables different affordable housing subsidy programs to talk to each other in order to ensure that affordable housing is provided equitably and efficiently. So while we are trying to make sure that we're hitting the lowest AMIs possible, it's something that's defined at the federal level. And I'm not sure even what chaos would ensue if we tried to calculate a different number for every neighborhood in New York City. That would be a question for HPD. It would present significant obstacles, I would say, in order to provide affordable housing if we had different regimes for every community district or different regimes for every council district or something like that. So, but thank you for your question.
Okay, if we could go to the raised hand, Tanisha. Just checking to make sure our Zoom.
Tanisha's being promoted. It just may be taking a moment for her system.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go, team, if you're okay, go to Florence. Florence, can you hear us? You might have to unmute yourself.
Good evening. Thank you for having this very important meeting. There was a lot to unpack with the first two portions of the City of Yes, and I'm hoping that this one is a little bit easier to understand. There are a lot of questions for years and years around land use and the AMI, how the AMI is determined by the government. And then as communities change and people come into communities like Western Queens that are being developed, as people of higher income come in, the AMI changes and it impacts the residents of Western Queens. For example, there are many NYCHA developments where people would like to move out of NYCHA and have the opportunity to get into real affordable housing. But at the AMI that exists now, the average person can't get out. Can you please discuss the AMI and the fact that it's looked at pre-tax before your taxes are taken out of your salary and how that impacts people in the city of New York?
Thanks. Those are great questions. AMI, area median income, is determined at the federal level by HUD, and they create one typically for each metropolitan statistical area, or urban area. In New York City, it includes the city plus some outlying areas in New York State. So it isn't actually different from neighborhood to neighborhood, and it doesn't change in a given neighborhood because of people moving in or moving out or anything like that. We recognize, the hardships that rising housing costs present in New York City. We recognize the need for affordable housing. And so through this proposal and through others that are not on the agenda for tonight, but that we'll discuss at future info sessions, the aim really is to hit as low an AMI as possible, and then to enable income averaging to serve a wider range of New York City families, from folks who are unable to work for whatever reason and have very little income, to folks who work in the service industry, to, like I said, city employees, to folks families at a range of incomes. And so that's our approach: hit as low an AMI as possible and then enable income averaging so that we can provide affordable housing to a much broader swath of New York City than we can today through the zoning.
Thanks, John. I see Tanisha. Hopefully you're available. Can you hear us?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Good.
I don't know what's going on. Hey, thanks for the presentation. I have two questions. My first question is, when you say that we need more housing and that we need to build more housing, what about all the empty apartments that landlords are holding on to because they want market rate and they don't want rent stabilized rent and they don't want to take the Section 8 vouchers? That's my first question. And my second question is, from what I understand, we're sinking. So how is more housing going to affect the weight that all of the heavy buildings are already, putting on the island that we live on?
Thank you. Those are great questions. And we've, heard a lot about that in some of our other meetings around here. We've heard from our we're working with NYCHA as well. We've heard from them that their vacancy rates in NYCHA developments are at historic lows. Like I said, earlier too, the vacancy rate for rental apartments more generally in New York City remains at emergency levels. We've heard from our partner agency at HPD that, contrary to what you might hear, there are not abnormal levels of vacancy and rent stabilized housing at this point as well. So, as much as we wish that there was some supply of housing that already exists that we could get people into in order to address some of the human consequences of the existing housing shortage. Unfortunately, there's not, and we have to enable, ways to increase the amount of housing for all the people who want to live in New York City, in order to address things like the rising housing costs, gentrification and displacement pressure, overcrowding, homelessness, things like that. So that's what we're trying to do. You mentioned voucher units, and that's a really great point. In fact, it should have been in the main presentation. In working with, again, HPD, we discovered that a lot of the affordable units that are created through zoning programs like voluntary inclusionary housing that would be created through something like UAP actually go to voucher holders. And so if we are creating a ton of new affordable housing through UAP, then we are expanding the supply of units for folks who got that voucher and who are looking for a place to use it. So, and that means that they can take their voucher, not just to, some far-flung neighborhood with a landlord who needs to take a voucher holder because nobody wants to rent it on the open market or whatever, but also in new developments, in new construction, in neighborhoods across the city. UAP will create opportunities for voucher holders. They're one of the main beneficiaries of the housing lottery today, and we hope to, reinforce that in the future. Oh, as far as the sinking question goes, I don't believe that construction, at least outside of certain areas, maybe special coastal risk districts or something like that, that new development is leading to subsidence issues or anything like that. And so we don't expect to see any consequences for that. As I said, we're in the midst of environmental review, but that has not been on our radar.
Thank you. Let's go to another raised hand, Hazel. And then we'll go back to some of the written questions.
Hazel, you should be seeing a pop-up on your screen, asking you to accept promotion to panelist. But I can also allow you to talk as an attendee. Oh,
I see Hazel.
okay, she got in.
Hazel, if you unmic, you should be able to speak. Can you hit the mute button? Okay, why don't we go to some written questions? And Hazel, if you are having technical difficulties, just reach out. You should be able to reach out to the team. But we'll just go to written until we can hear from you. So for income averaging, will every building be required to offer affordable units at different income levels? Or will the income averaging just be used to determine one citywide number?
If income averaging continues to work as it does through the MIH program. We would not mandate that development's income average, but they can choose up to 3 income bands to provide within a given development in order to hit that broader range of incomes. We haven't reached that level of detail in terms of how income averaging works, but that's a good comment for us to keep in mind. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the next question, if a development is already going to be 100% affordable, similar to HPD financing, using HPD financing or other types of public subsidies, will they automatically qualify for UAP? Will developers of any type of housing have to go through any approval process to build the additional units?
Yeah, great question. So projects that are 100% affordable, whether they're being financed by our partner agency, HBT, they will be able to take advantage of the UAP framework and tap into those higher FARs. For actual implementation process, that's still something we're working out the finer details of for how exactly developers that want to take advantage of UAP, what kind of process that'll look like for actually making sure that those units that they're creating are actually affordable and being marketed at the right AMI levels.
Thank you, Winnie. This one is going back to the parking issues. There's just observations throughout the community of many developers not really meeting or caring what the community feels about parking issues. Can you just talk a little bit about just how the market works when it comes to parking in our neighborhoods, in our different neighborhoods?
Yeah, definitely hear that. So right now, developers generally build according to what the market demands. So if they believe that off-street parking is something that will be useful for future tenants, it'd be a requirement for future tenants that they're looking to market to. We believe that developers will provide that parking spaces. As we know, many people with parking on site still choose to park on the street just because it's free. So not necessarily requiring parking by the developer will be particularly useful for meeting those parking needs.
And the next question is just about excessive construction of development that's already taking place, specifically in East Flatbush at this moment, is where this question is going. With the excessive construction in East Flatbush, which has already taken place, will that count towards any construction requirements that may be coming out of this work, which I don't believe is true, but can you clarify that?
Sure.
Yes.
No construction requirements through this. This allows things, but zoning can't make things happen. We can't force people to use the zoning and build. You mentioned East Flatbush. I mentioned East Flatbush a little bit earlier in the presentation as well. I think that's a great example of a neighborhood that sees a ton of development under the status quo, under the existing zoning regime, because there are so many other parts of the city where you can't build. And so development gets pushed to the few parts of the city where you can, and we would say overburden some parts of the city. By enabling a little more housing in every neighborhood from the lowest density areas to the highest, we fully expect to be taking pressure off of those neighborhoods that see the most development today or that see the most displacement and gentrification gentrification and displacement pressures from people going farther and farther out in the city looking for housing that they can afford. So this proposal really is for you and neighborhoods like this, like East Flatbush, like we mentioned earlier, Community District 9, PLG. We mentioned Bedford Park, other parts of the city that see a lot of development today.
Hey. So the next question has really been about process, and this has been a continuous question through all of City of Yes text amendments. So if you've been with us with carbon neutrality, you've been with us with economic opportunity, there's been several questions about how does this affect the landmarking process and the community preservation process. In all of these cases, this does not change anything for landmarks. Landmarks will continue with its review. I don't know if John and Winnie wanted to add anything to that, but we want to make sure that's really clear, and we'll continue to repeat that like Landmark still has its review.
That's exactly right. LPC, Landmark Preservation Commission, and their procedures, that's outlined in local law and it's not in the zoning. So we're not proposing to change any role that they have or oversight that they have in terms of creating landmarks or maintain or helping to oversee them over time. There is one detail in our housing proposals that would actually provide support for existing and future landmarks, and that's to expand the program in the zoning that enables landmarks to sell unused development rights that are generated on their site that they can't use on their sites because it's a landmark and it has to remain mostly as is. It dates back to the 1960s. Today, you can only sell to property owners that are very close to you, adjacent or would be adjacent, if not for a street. And it takes a full special permit, which is a ULURP, 2 years, few $100,000 to do. So we're seeking to broaden that transfer radius a little bit so that there are more potential buyers for those development rights. We're seeking to reduce the procedure involved so that more landmarks, many of which are struggling, to pay the heightened maintenance costs to maintain a landmark in first class condition over time, to support them and support the landmark program more generally through the zoning. But that's just one detail that we'll discuss in future info sessions.
Okay, another question from the chat, from the Q&A function. How will City of Yes affect projects that are in the pipeline, specifically with developers be allowed to revamp their plans reflecting new FAR for additional units?
Yeah, great question. So building permits are subject to the zoning that's in place at the time that they're filed. So permits can be refiled though to modify a development pursuant to the new zoning if that zoning changes in the process. We talked a little bit about timeline, but this text amendment is likely not to get passed until the end of this year, for example. For projects that come through DCP and that be in public review while housing opportunities being reviewed, we're going to be advising on a case-by-case basis how the project might get affected by housing opportunity.
Thank you, Winnie. So I am going to do a time check. We're almost at 8:30. So we'll be at the point of 2 hours of this conversation. We are going to answer a few more questions that are in the chat. But we have documented all the questions that have come in, and we will make sure that we are reviewing them and including them in conversations that we have in the future. So just get to a couple more. Can you talk more about DCP's community outreach strategy? What are the stakeholders? Who are the stakeholders DCP is engaging? I think we can probably all take this one. So I would say, we're really trying to reach everyone that we can. We've been doing many public meetings. We've had a handful of info sessions over the last over a year. And we are now really taking the moment in time to really do monthly conversations. That does not mean by any means that we can't have conversations with any of you at any time. We encourage you to use our email address. We'll make sure to drop it into the chat, into the information box, so that you can have that, as well as the website. If team, you could drop that in as well. We have been talking to practitioners. We've been talking to people where they are and going to communities to make sure that we are hearing what is really important to them in their community and how we can make sure that them and their families have safe housing in the city. So, please reach out to us with anyone that you might want us to join your group. Thank you, Winnie, for dropping that in. And we will be attending lots of community events that are hosted by other coalitions, other organizations in your community, and we'll make sure to have those posted in the newsletter. If you go to our webpage, you'll be able to sign up for our newsletter to see where we'll be. And of course, as we enter into the public review process later in the spring, we will be at every single community board to make sure that we are in the place to have these conversations. So again, please just reach out. We would love to be able to have more conversations with you and please attend these sessions, which will give us an opportunity to have a good dialogue of the questions that are on your mind. So what process is being done to include and bring housing to those already in homeless shelters? This is a question that I actually hear quite a bit about homeless shelters. I don't know, Winnie and John, if you'd like to address that, if you could address that. Will they be given
Totally.
any type of priority?
That's a absolutely fantastic question. We haven't talked as much tonight about the ways in which UAP will enable a much larger amount of supportive housing by making it easier across the full range of zoning districts to create supportive housing, which today often have limits on FAR, that is building size, that are even below other forms of housing today. In other districts, you have to go through a full special permit. Again, ULURP, 2 years, hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to build supportive housing to the maximum that a district allows. We are raising supportive housing FARs across the board. We are reducing the procedure necessary in those districts I mentioned to achieve the maximum FAR to make the production of supportive housing more efficient, and so that we see more of it. Of course, not everybody in the shelter system in this day and age, where the housing crisis hits, up into the middle class, not everybody in the shelter system needs supportive services. So for that, we have, other types of affordable units without supportive services. HPD has a set-aside program for people coming out of the shelter system. It's a proportion. And so the more affordable housing we can create, the more dedicated units for families coming out of the shelter system that we can create. There's a direct proportional relationship there. And so, if we increase affordable housing production by, 35 or 50%, we are increasing the number of units for people coming out of the shelter system by 35 or 50% as well.
Thank you, John. Will UAP and the end to parking mandates apply to affordable home ownership units as well? This is a question we may get to later on, but it'd be great to hear a little bit about that.
Yes, the UAP represents a simple zoning framework where your market rate cap is where it is today and your affordable cap is at least 20% higher than that. That applies to rental. That applies to home ownership. Zoning actually is not legally able to distinguish between those two things. And then the eliminating parking mandates applies to all types of housing as well, whether it's rental, whether it's home ownership, whether it's affordable, whether it's market rate. So yes, affordable home ownership will be able to take advantage of the higher FARs that we're proposing here. And they will also not have to provide housing. They will not face parking mandates as well.
Great, thank you for that clarification. I actually wasn't even aware that it was going to a home ownership, so I appreciate that clarification for myself too. Okay, so we are close to time. We are at 8:30, so let's do one more question in the chat. This initiative really appears to address the higher density districts. The maps show that these initiatives barely affect within Staten Island. Just wondering if there's a more significant, sorry, question got cut off. So just wondering about how this initiative works in high density districts versus low density districts.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to our upcoming info sessions, which will speak more on our proposals that will enable more housing opportunities in our low density neighborhoods, like Staten Island, for example, primarily low density. So we have one coming next month, February 27th. They'll look at ADUs, conversions, and shared and small homes, as well as March 27th, which I think will be particularly exciting for our low density residents, because that'll be focused on our missing middle housing types, which would be most relevant for Steinlein, for example. So definitely come through for our other info sessions. They're available on our website that I just plugged into the chat if you want to register for those Zoom links as well.
Great. Well, I thank everybody for your questions. This is just a beginning of this series, and we're really hoping that you'll be joining us for the next several months. You have our contact information. Please reach out to us with any questions or ideas of people that we should be outreaching to. And thank you, Winnie and John, for being here with us. And we look forward to all seeing you next month on February 27th to talk about diverse housing types. Thank you all.